There are public figures who become famous because people love them, and there are public figures who become impossible to ignore because people cannot stop arguing about them. Pastor Jamal Bryant has spent much of his adult life standing somewhere between those two realities. To his supporters, he is a bold preacher, a sharp communicator, and a church leader who understands that faith cannot be separated from the struggles of real people. To his critics, he is a man who has too often blurred the line between spiritual leadership, celebrity culture, political theater, and personal controversy. And now, as his name continues to circulate in conversations far beyond the walls of the church, one thing is becoming harder to deny. Things are not looking simple for Pastor Jamal Bryant anymore. Not because one single event has defined him, and not because one headline can explain him, but because his entire public life has become a kind of pressure chamber, where every sermon, every interview, every statement, every alliance, and every old story can be pulled back into the light and judged all over again. For a pastor, that is a dangerous place to live. The pulpit is supposed to be a place of moral authority, but in the modern media age, it can also become a stage, a courtroom, and a battleground at the same time. Bryant knows this better than most. He did not rise quietly. He did not build his reputation by staying neutral. He came into public life as a preacher with a gift for language, a taste for confrontation, and an instinct for the dramatic moment. He understood how to speak in a way that sounded urgent. He knew how to connect the Bible to headlines, how to make a sermon feel like a news broadcast, a protest speech, and a personal challenge all at once. That ability made him powerful. It also made him vulnerable, because the more a preacher speaks into everything, the more everything eventually speaks back. Jamal Bryant's public story cannot be separated from the larger world that shaped him. He emerged from a tradition where the black church was never just a Sunday institution. It was a refuge, a political engine, a cultural classroom, a place where grief and strategy often shared the same pew. In that tradition, a pastor was not only expected to preach salvation. He was expected to speak about injustice, voting rights, police violence, poverty, education, and dignity. Bryant inherited that expectation, but he also came of age in a media environment that rewarded speed, sharpness, and visibility. The old model of the pastor as a local shepherd was being replaced by something much larger. The pastor as brand, commentator, activist, influencer, and national personality. Bryant stepped into that shift with confidence. He had the voice, the charisma, and the instinct for attention. He could sound prophetic to one audience and provocative to another. He could make supporters feel seen and make opponents feel attacked. That combination created momentum. But momentum has a cost. When a pastor becomes a public brand, the public begins to treat him like one. They do not only listen to the sermon, they examine the lifestyle. They revisit the relationships. They compare the message to the messenger. They ask whether the man calling for accountability has fully answered for his own. And for Bryant, that question has followed him for years. What makes Bryant such a complicated figure is that his influence is real. This is not a man speaking to an empty room. He has led major congregations, drawn national attention, and repeatedly inserted himself into conversations that many religious leaders would rather avoid. Whether the issue is economic pressure, racial justice, consumer activism, or political power, Bryant rarely presents himself as a quiet observer. He presents himself as a combatant. That is part of his appeal. In a culture where many people feel that institutions have become too cautious, too polished, and too afraid of backlash, Bryant offers a different kind of religious personality. Direct, emotional, confrontational, and sometimes unapologetically theatrical. His supporters see courage in that. They see a pastor willing to say what others whisper. They see a leader who does not believe the church should be locked inside stained glass while communities struggle outside. But the same qualities that make him attractive to one crowd make him alarming to another. To his critics, Bryant's style can look less like prophetic leadership and more like performance. They ask whether the drama serves the mission, or whether the mission has become fuel for the drama. And once that question enters the room, it becomes very difficult to remove. The tension around Bryant is not just about theology, it is about trust. A pastor's authority depends on more than intelligence or stage presence. It depends on the belief that the person speaking from the pulpit is not merely managing an image. In Bryant's case, the image has often been contested. Over the years, he has faced public scrutiny around his personal life, his relationships, and the gap that critics claim exists between his message and his choices. Those conversations have not disappeared. They resurface whenever he steps into a new controversy or makes a bold public claim. That is the burden of a high-profile pastor with a complicated past. The past does not stay behind him. It travels with him, waiting for the next moment of public attention. Every new headline becomes a doorway for old questions. Every public campaign becomes an invitation for people to ask whether he has the moral standing to lead it. This does not mean every criticism is fair. Public figures are often judged without mercy, and pastors, especially black pastors who speak politically, can become targets for attacks that are not only personal but ideological. But it does mean Bryant operates under a level of scrutiny that cannot be dismissed as simple jealousy or opposition. When someone builds a ministry on moral urgency, people will eventually ask whether that urgency also applies inward. This is why the phrase, "things aren't looking good," carries more weight than a typical scandal headline. It does not necessarily mean Bryant is finished. In fact, if his career has shown anything, it is that he has a remarkable ability to survive controversy, redirect attention, and return to the center of conversation. But survival is not the same as stability. Influence can grow while trust erodes. Visibility can increase while credibility becomes more fragile. A leader can still draw crowds and still face a deeper problem: the sense that every move is now being watched for contradiction. Bryant's challenge is not simply that people disagree with him. Strong leaders are always disagreed with. His challenge is that some people no longer know whether they are watching ministry, activism, personal branding, or political spectacle. And when the categories become that blurred, even supporters can begin to feel uneasy. They may still admire his fire, but wonder about the smoke. They may still believe in the causes he raises, but question the strategy. They may still defend the man, but worry about the pattern. At the center of this story is a larger question about what the modern church wants from its most visible leaders. Does it want a pastor who stays carefully above the fight, or one who steps directly into it? Does it want moral purity, or does it accept flawed messengers if the message still moves people? Does it want activism from the pulpit, or does it fear that politics will swallow the gospel? Bryant forces all of these questions into the open because he embodies the conflict. He is both a product of the prophetic black church tradition and a figure shaped by the attention economy. He speaks the language of justice, but he also understands the mechanics of virality. He can sound like an old-school revival preacher one moment and a media strategist the next. That combination has kept him relevant, but it has also made him vulnerable to the accusation that the spotlight itself has become part of the ministry. And once a pastor is accused of loving the spotlight too much, every public act becomes harder to interpret generously. So the story of Pastor Jamal Bryant is not just the story of a preacher under pressure. It is the story of a man standing at the intersection of faith, fame, politics, and public suspicion. It is the story of a church culture trying to decide how much controversy it can tolerate from leaders who claim to fight for the people. It is the story of a media age where redemption is possible, but forgetting is almost impossible. And as Bryant continues to speak, lead, provoke, and defend his place in the public square, the question becomes sharper. Is he facing another temporary storm, the kind he has survived before, or is this the beginning of a deeper reckoning with the image he has built, the expectations he has raised, and the trust he still needs to keep? To understand why the pressure around Pastor Jamal Bryant feels so intense, you have to understand the kind of platform he built. Bryant was never simply a preacher who stayed inside the predictable rhythm of Sunday service, Bible study, and church administration. He became a voice that moved across multiple arenas at once. He preached like a man who wanted the sanctuary to feel alive, but he also spoke like someone who knew the microphone could travel far beyond the church walls. That is where his influence grew, and that is also where his problems became bigger. A local pastor can sometimes recover from controversy inside the private language of a congregation. A national pastor cannot. Once the audience expands, the judgment expands with it. Every sermon becomes content. Every mistake becomes searchable. Every contradiction becomes a clip. And for Bryant, who has often chosen to be loud in public matters, silence from the public was never going to be an option when questions turned back toward him. His rise was built on a particular kind of charisma. Bryant could take frustration that many people felt but could not organize, and turn it into language. He had the timing of a performer, the cadence of a revivalist, and the confidence of an activist who believed neutrality was a form of betrayal. In a community where many people felt overlooked by political systems, economic structures, and mainstream media, Bryant's voice carried the appeal of urgency. He did not sound like a man asking politely for permission to be heard. He sounded like someone entering the room with a demand. That style created emotional loyalty. People do not only follow leaders because they agree with every detail. They follow them because the leader gives shape to their anger, dignity to their pain, and a sense that somebody is willing to fight publicly on their behalf. Bryant understood that power. He knew that preaching, in his tradition, could be both spiritual medicine and social confrontation. But once a leader becomes the voice of confrontation, the public eventually expects him to withstand confrontation too. That is where the Bryant story becomes more difficult. His critics do not simply attack his positions. They question his consistency. They look at his public activism and then return to his personal controversies. They hear him speak with moral force and ask whether moral force requires a cleaner record. This is the brutal economy of public leadership. The stronger your message, the more aggressively people inspect the messenger. Bryant's defenders often argue that the church has always been filled with imperfect people, and that redemption is central to the faith he preaches. That argument matters. Christianity itself is built around confession, restoration, and the possibility that a person is not permanently defined by failure. But public trust does not operate exactly like doctrine. People may believe in forgiveness and still hesitate to follow. They may accept that a leader is human and still wonder whether he has learned enough from the moments that damaged confidence. Redemption can be spiritual, but credibility is social. It has to be rebuilt in front of people who remember. For Bryant, the challenge is intensified by the fact that his public identity is not modest. He does not present himself as a small, wounded, behind-the-scenes pastor quietly doing repair work. He presents himself as a major voice with major claims. When he speaks against corporations, politicians, or cultural enemies, he does it with the language of battle. That makes him compelling, but it also creates a higher standard. People begin to ask whether the man calling others to account is equally transparent about his own house. This does not mean he must satisfy every critic, because no public figure ever can. But it does mean the old strategy of simply moving forward may not be enough. In the past, leaders could outlast a news cycle. Today, the news cycle has memory. Social media has no statute of limitations. A clip from yesterday can stand beside a story from 10 years ago, and audiences are invited to connect them whether the connection is fair or not. Bryant lives inside that reality. The deeper issue is that Bryant's ministry sits in a space where spiritual leadership and political branding constantly overlap. When he speaks about consumer boycotts, elections, racial justice, or institutional accountability, he is not only preaching to believers. He is speaking to journalists, activists, politicians, skeptics, and enemies waiting for a mistake. That means his church role becomes inseparable from his public role. Supporters may see this as necessary. They may argue that a pastor who refuses to confront public injustice has already failed the gospel. Critics may see it as dangerous. They may argue that the pulpit becomes unstable when it is used too often as a political weapon. Bryant has built his relevance inside that tension, but tension is not a stable foundation forever. It can energize a movement, but it can also exhaust a congregation. People can be inspired by constant battle for a while, but eventually they ask what is being built, not just what is being attacked. And that is the question beginning to follow Bryant more closely. What is he building? Is he building a stronger church, a broader movement, a personal platform, or some complicated mixture of all three? The answer depends on whom you ask. His supporters point to his ability to mobilize people, speak boldly, and keep the church connected to real-world issues. They see a leader who refuses to let faith become passive. His critics point to the repeated controversies, the sharp public style, and the sense that attention often gathers around the personality as much as the mission. They see a leader whose gifts are undeniable, but whose public presence may create as many distractions as victories. The uncomfortable truth is that both views can contain pieces of reality. Bryant may be a gifted preacher and a polarizing figure at the same time. He may be sincere in his activism and still drawn to spectacle. He may help people feel powerful, while also making others question whether the performance is becoming too costly. This is why his current public image feels fragile. It is not because he lacks talent. Talent has never been the issue. If anything, Bryant's talent is part of the problem, because it has allowed him to survive moments that might have ended a less gifted leader's career. He can preach through tension. He can turn criticism into momentum. He can speak in a way that makes supporters feel the attack on him is really an attack on the cause. But the longer a leader relies on charisma to outrun questions, the heavier those questions become. At some point, the issue is no longer whether he can command attention. The issue is whether attention can still be converted into trust. For a pastor, that difference is everything. A crowd can gather around controversy, but a church must be built on confidence. A viral moment can make a man visible, but it cannot automatically make him credible. And as Jamal Bryant continues to stand in the public eye, that may be the real test waiting for him. Not whether he can survive another wave of criticism, but whether he can convince people that behind the fire, the fight, and the headlines, there is still a foundation strong enough to carry the weight of the ministry he claims to lead. The hardest part of Pastor Jamal Bryant's public story is that the pressure does not come from one direction. If this were only about a political statement, he could defend the statement. If it were only about a sermon that offended people, he could explain the sermon. If it were only about old personal criticism, he could say he has grown beyond it. But Bryant's problem is cumulative. The controversies, the bold claims, the personal questions, the political activism, the media appearances, and the constant public visibility all stack on top of each other until the audience begins to see not isolated moments, but a pattern. That is when a public figure enters a more dangerous stage. People stop asking, "What happened this time?" and start asking, "Why does this keep happening around him?" For a pastor, that shift matters deeply, because ministry depends on the belief that the leader is not merely surviving chaos, but guiding people through it. When the leader himself becomes the center of the storm too often, even loyal followers can begin to feel tired. Bryant's supporters would argue that this fatigue is unfair. They would say that prophetic leadership has always created resistance, and that the people who challenge power are usually the ones most aggressively attacked by power. There is truth in that. The history of black religious leadership in America is filled with pastors who were criticized, mocked, surveilled, threatened, and misunderstood because they refused to make faith quiet. A pastor who speaks about racism, poverty, corporate conduct, voting rights, or political hypocrisy will always attract enemies. Bryant often places himself inside that tradition, and for many of his followers, that framing is persuasive. They see a man willing to fight battles that more comfortable leaders avoid. They see a pastor using his platform not just to entertain churchgoers, but to pressure systems. And when criticism rises, they may interpret it not as evidence of failure, but as proof that he is touching something powerful enough to push back. But there is another side to that argument, and Bryant cannot easily escape it. Not every criticism of a public pastor is persecution. Sometimes it is accountability. Sometimes people are not attacking the mission, they are questioning the method. Sometimes they are not trying to silence a prophetic voice. They are asking whether the voice has become too entangled with ego, celebrity, and spectacle. That distinction is crucial. If every challenge is dismissed as an attack, then a leader becomes almost impossible to correct. If every critic is treated as an enemy, then genuine concern gets buried under defensive language. This is one of the dangers facing any charismatic religious figure. The stronger the loyalty around him, the easier it becomes to confuse protection with truth. A leader surrounded only by applause can begin to mistake survival for vindication. Bryant's greatest test may not come from his enemies. It may come from whether the people closest to him are willing to tell him when the platform is becoming heavier than the purpose. The modern church has changed the rules of pastoral visibility. Decades ago, a pastor's reputation was shaped mostly by the congregation, the local community, and perhaps regional networks. Today, a pastor can be judged by people who have never attended his church, never heard a full sermon, and only know him through 30-second clips, headlines, reaction videos, and social media posts. That world rewards extremes. It does not reward nuance. If Bryant says something provocative, the most inflammatory sentence may travel farther than the full context. If he launches a public campaign, people may debate the strategy before they understand the reason. If an old controversy resurfaces, it can be packaged as if it happened yesterday. In that environment, a pastor is not only preaching to souls, he is managing digital perception. And perception can become more powerful than fact. Once people believe they understand who Bryant is, every news story gets forced into that belief. This is why the phrase "things aren't looking good" does not need to mean that Bryant has lost his church or his influence. It can mean something more subtle. The atmosphere around him has become unstable. He may still command attention. He may still draw support. He may still preach with force. But the trust environment is more complicated than before. Every major leader has two audiences. The first audience already believes in him and will likely defend him. The second audience is not fully convinced, but remains open to persuasion. The danger begins when that second audience starts shrinking. When undecided people stop listening, the leader is left speaking mainly to believers and opponents. The middle disappears, and when the middle disappears, every public moment becomes a battle instead of a bridge. Bryant's voice has often been strongest in battle, but long-term leadership requires more than winning arguments. It requires building confidence among people who are not already emotionally committed. There is also a generational issue underneath the criticism. Younger audiences are often less willing to separate a leader's public message from his private conduct. They grew up in a world of receipts, screenshots, exposed hypocrisy, and institutional distrust. Many of them do not automatically grant authority to a title, a collar, a pulpit, or a church legacy. They ask different questions. Who benefits from this platform? Is the leader accountable? Are the people being served? Or are they being used to strengthen a brand? Does the message match the behavior? Bryant's old-school preaching power may still move a room, but the newer audience evaluates leadership through a harsher lens. They are not impressed by volume alone. They want transparency. They want consistency. They want leaders who can admit complexity without turning every critique into warfare. Shift creates a serious challenge for pastors like Bryant, whose public style was forged in a more confrontational, personality-driven era. And yet, it would be too simple to frame Bryant only as a man in decline. That would miss why he remains relevant. Controversial figures often remain powerful because they represent unresolved tensions in the culture around them. Bryant is not just one pastor with a microphone. He is a symbol of a larger argument about what the church should be in public life. Should it comfort, confront, organize, protest, entertain, heal, discipline, or disrupt? Bryant says, in effect, that it must do more than sit quietly. His critics respond that doing more does not excuse doing it recklessly. That unresolved argument keeps him in the center of attention. People are not only reacting to him, they are reacting to what he represents. He forces churches, viewers, and critics to decide how much imperfection they can tolerate in a leader who speaks to real pain. So as the scrutiny around Pastor Jamal Bryant continues, The deeper story is not whether one controversy will end him. It is whether the accumulation of questions will finally slow him down. The danger for Bryant is not that people stop talking about him. In modern media, being talked about can still look like power. The real danger is that people keep talking, but with less belief. They may watch, but not trust. They may share the clips, but not follow the vision. They may admire the fire, but doubt the foundation. And for any pastor, that is a far more serious problem than bad press. Because bad press can fade, but weakened trust becomes part of the architecture. It settles into the walls. It changes how every sermon sounds. It makes every applause feel slightly uncertain. And if Bryant cannot separate the mission from the noise surrounding his name, the storm around him may no longer be something he preaches through. It may become the very thing that defines him. What makes Pastor Jamal Bryant's situation even more complicated is that he is not operating in a neutral environment. He is operating in a country where religion, race, politics, money, media, and identity are all colliding at the same time. Every public statement from a high-profile pastor can be pulled into a larger ideological fight. If Bryant criticizes a corporation, some people hear a moral challenge while others hear political theater. If he speaks about justice, some hear prophetic courage while others hear partisan messaging. If he defends himself, supporters hear resilience while critics hear evasion. This is the trap of becoming a symbolic figure. Once a leader becomes a symbol, people stop responding only to what he says. They respond to what they believe he represents. Bryant represents, to some, a fearless black church tradition that refuses to let faith become passive. To others, he represents the modern celebrity pastor, whose public profile has grown so large that it sometimes seems to overshadow the spiritual work itself. Both readings follow him everywhere, and neither disappears easily. The question of money also lingers around any public ministry, even when no single allegation defines the moment. Churches are spiritual institutions, but they also require budgets, staff, buildings, broadcasts, donors, partnerships, and public campaigns. When a pastor becomes a national personality, the financial imagination around that pastor grows. People begin to wonder how influence is funded, who benefits from public visibility, and whether activism is being used to serve communities or strengthen a personal brand. Bryant, because of his high-profile style, cannot avoid those questions. Even when he is speaking about serious social issues, skeptics may ask whether the moment is also good for his platform. That suspicion is one of the most damaging forces a pastor can face. It does not require proof of wrongdoing to weaken trust. Suspicion alone can change the way people listen. A sermon that once sounded like conviction can begin to sound like positioning. A campaign that once looked bold can begin to look calculated. And once audiences begin reading motives instead of hearing messages, the leader has already entered dangerous territory. At the same time, Bryant's defenders would say this suspicion is part of a larger hostility toward outspoken black religious leadership. They would argue that whenever a black pastor builds influence outside the sanctuary, critics become eager to frame that influence as manipulation, ego, or hustle. That argument should not be dismissed lightly. The black church has often been one of the few institutions with enough moral memory and community infrastructure to challenge power directly. Leaders emerging from that tradition have always been judged more harshly when they step into politics or economics. Bryant's campaigns, speeches, and public pressure efforts can be read as part of that inheritance. He is not inventing the idea that a pastor should confront public systems. He is working inside a tradition where faith is expected to have consequences in the street, in the voting booth, in the workplace, and in the marketplace. For many people, that is precisely why Bryant still matters. He refuses to reduce religion to private emotion, but the defense has limits. A tradition can explain a leader's style, but it cannot excuse every weakness in execution. The fact that prophetic preaching has a history does not mean every provocative statement is wise. The fact that activism belongs in the black church tradition does not mean every campaign is strategically sound. The fact that a pastor faces unfair attacks does not mean all criticism is unfair. Bryant's challenge is that he often operates in the gray zone between moral urgency and public spectacle. That gray zone can be powerful when handled carefully, but destructive when handled carelessly. It can mobilize people quickly, but it can also create backlash faster than trust can absorb. And when a pastor lives repeatedly in that gray zone, the audience begins to ask whether he is leading people through controversy or simply creating more of it. The weight on Bryant is also institutional. As the leader of a major church, he is not only responsible for his own reputation. He carries the reputation of a congregation, a staff, a community, and a spiritual legacy. Every headline attached to his name can affect people who did not choose the spotlight. Congregants may come to church looking for healing, not another public debate. Staff members may be working faithfully behind the scenes, while the public conversation focuses almost entirely on the pastor's latest controversy. This is one of the hidden costs of celebrity ministry. The larger the personality at the center, the easier it becomes for the institution to be interpreted through that personality alone. A church can have programs, outreach, service, prayer, counseling, and real community impact. But if the pastor becomes the controversy, those quieter works can disappear from public view. Bryant's charisma may draw attention to the church, but attention is not always a gift. Sometimes it is a burden the whole institution must carry. There is also the personal question of whether Bryant can still control the story around him. Public figures often believe they can manage attention because they have done it before. They know how to answer critics, shift the conversation, create a new headline, or rally loyal supporters. Bryant has shown that ability many times. But control becomes harder when the narrative turns from individual events to character interpretation. A leader can explain what he said. He can clarify what he meant. He can apologize for a moment. But it is much harder to change the public sense of who he is. That is the battlefield Bryant now faces. The issue is not only what he does next. It is whether people will interpret what he does next through trust or suspicion. If the trust filter is strong, even mistakes can be forgiven. If the suspicion filter is stronger, even good actions can be questioned. This is why the next chapter of Bryant's public life may depend less on volume and more on discipline. He has already proven he can be loud, sharp, memorable, and fearless. What remains uncertain is whether he can be restrained when restraint would serve him better. The modern attention economy rewards the immediate reaction, the viral line, the enemy named out loud, the dramatic turn of phrase. But ministry requires more than reaction. It requires patience, steadiness, humility, and the willingness to let some battles pass without turning them into public theater. If Bryant wants to preserve long-term credibility, he may have to show not just that he can fight, but that he can discern which fights truly belong to the mission. That may be harder for him than surviving criticism, because it requires a different kind of strength. Not the strength to command a room, but the strength to resist the room when it wants performance more than wisdom. And this is where things begin to look uncertain. Jamal Bryant is not without influence, not without defenders, and not without a real base of people who believe in his voice. But influence can become unstable when it depends too heavily on confrontation. Defenders can become exhausted when they are asked to explain too much, too often. A base can remain loyal while the broader public grows colder. The danger is not a sudden collapse. It is gradual erosion, one question motive at a time, one resurfaced controversy at a time, one viral clip at a time, one sermon heard through doubt instead of faith. Bryant may still have the gifts that made him powerful, but gifts alone cannot repair a trust deficit. And if the public begins to believe that the storm is no longer around him but inside the way he leads, then the road ahead will be far more difficult than another headline, another backlash, or another defense from the pulpit. The most revealing thing about Pastor Jamal Bryant's public life is that he has never seemed comfortable with a small role. Some leaders are satisfied with local influence, steady ministry, and quiet respect. Bryant's instinct has always been different. He moves as if the church is not merely a building, but a command center. He speaks as if the pulpit is not just a sacred platform, but a pressure point in the national conversation. That kind of ambition can produce real impact. It can push people out of apathy. It can remind believers that faith should not be detached from suffering, injustice, or power. But ambition in ministry is a dangerous instrument. When it is disciplined, it can build movements. When it is unchecked, it can make the leader larger than the mission. And with Bryant, that is the question that keeps returning. Is his public force serving the work, or has the work become inseparable from the force of his public personality? This is not an easy question, because Bryant's personality is part of why people listen. His language is not bland. His delivery is not cautious. He understands drama, timing, tension, and emotional release. He knows how to make a congregation lean forward. He knows how to turn a social issue into a spiritual emergency. In an age where many churches struggle to hold attention, Bryant can still command it. That is no small skill. But the ability to command attention can become addictive, not only for the leader, but also for the audience. People begin to expect fire every time. They expect a target, a confrontation, a line that can be clipped and shared. The pastor becomes not just a shepherd, but a producer of moments. And when that happens, the slower parts of ministry, the parts that rarely go viral, can look almost invisible. Counseling does not trend. Repentance does not always make headlines. Institutional repair is not as exciting as public combat. Yet those quieter disciplines are often what determine whether a ministry is truly healthy. Bryant's defenders may say that critics focus too much on style because they do not want to deal with substance. They may argue that his tone only becomes a problem because the issues he raises are uncomfortable. That may be true in some cases. Many people prefer polite religion because polite religion asks little of them. A pastor who names injustice will always be accused of being divisive by those who benefit from silence. Bryant has built much of his reputation on refusing that silence. He has spoken as though the church must have a public spine, not just private devotion. That posture resonates with people who feel abandoned by institutions that speak carefully while communities suffer openly. To them, Bryant's sharpness is not a flaw. It is a weapon against indifference. But even a weapon must be handled with care. The danger comes when confrontation becomes the default posture rather than a strategic choice. If everything is a battle, then nothing can be examined calmly. If every critic is an enemy, then correction becomes impossible. If every controversy is framed as proof of importance, then the leader may never pause long enough to ask whether the controversy was necessary in the first place. This is where Bryant's leadership faces its hardest test. His ability to rally people is proven. His ability to provoke reaction is proven. His ability to survive public scrutiny is proven. What is less clear is whether he can step back from the cycle of provocation and response that has so often defined his public image. A leader who only knows how to escalate may eventually find himself surrounded by flames he can no longer control. The public also has a complicated relationship with religious redemption. People say they believe in second chances, but they often keep a permanent archive of first failures. For a pastor, this contradiction is especially intense. The church preaches grace, but church audiences can be unforgiving when the person asking for grace also claims authority over others. Bryant's past controversies, whether fairly or unfairly revisited, create a background noise that never fully disappears. It is not always loud, but it is there. It hums beneath the applause. It returns whenever he speaks about morality, leadership, or accountability. The more forcefully he calls others to change, the more aggressively some people ask whether he has fully confronted his own story. That is the burden of public ministry. The sermon and the biography are never completely separate. At this point, Bryant's challenge is not simply to defend himself. Defense can win a moment, but it rarely rebuilds trust. A strong rebuttal may satisfy supporters, but it does not necessarily reach those who are tired of the pattern. What he needs, if the pressure continues, is something deeper than argument. He needs visible steadiness. He needs a season where the work speaks louder than the controversy. He needs to show that his leadership is not dependent on outrage to remain relevant. That does not mean abandoning activism. It means proving that activism can be rooted in discipline, transparency, and sustained community benefit rather than only dramatic public confrontation. The question is whether Bryant, whose gifts have so often flourished in conflict, can also lead powerfully in quiet consistency. Because quiet consistency may be the one thing the attention economy cannot manufacture. It cannot be clipped into a viral moment. It cannot be performed in one sermon. It is built slowly, over time, through decisions that may never trend. It is built when a leader takes responsibility, without turning it into theater. It is built when a church's impact becomes more visible than the pastor's controversy. It is built when people who are not already loyal begin to say, reluctantly at first, that perhaps the work is stronger than the noise. That is the road back from suspicion. But it is a difficult road because it requires the leader to resist the very tools that helped create his influence. This is why things feel uncertain for Pastor Jamal Bryant. He is not a marginal figure struggling to be noticed. He is a highly visible leader struggling with the consequences of being noticed too much, too often, and too controversially. He has the intelligence to understand the moment, the rhetorical skill to respond to it, and the support base to survive it. But survival may no longer be the highest measure. The deeper question is whether he can convert attention into renewed trust, and whether he can convince people that his ministry is more than a sequence of public battles. If he cannot, then the danger is not that he disappears. The danger is that he remains visible while becoming less persuasive. And for a preacher, that may be the quietest and most devastating loss of all. Still having the microphone, still having the stage, still having the crowd, but realizing that more people are listening for the contradiction than for the message. What separates a temporary controversy from a lasting crisis is not the noise itself, but what the noise reveals. For Pastor Jamal Bryant, the public pressure surrounding him reveals a deeper struggle over authority. In earlier generations, a pastor's authority often came from position. If he stood behind the pulpit, led a historic church, carried a recognized title, and spoke with spiritual confidence, many people were prepared to listen. Today, authority has to be renegotiated almost every day. People do not simply accept the office. They investigate the person. They search the history. They compare statements. They question motives. They look for contradictions. Bryant is leading in a time when the pulpit still has power, but it no longer shields the person standing behind it. In fact, for a pastor as visible as Bryant, the pulpit can make the scrutiny even harsher. The higher the moral language, the sharper the public inspection becomes. This is why Bryant's situation cannot be measured only by attendance, followers, applause, or media coverage. Those numbers can suggest influence, but they do not always prove trust. A crowd can gather for many reasons. Some come to be inspired. Some come to watch controversy unfold. Some come because they believe. Some come because they are curious. Some come because they want to see whether the man at the center of the storm can still command the room. That is the complicated nature of modern visibility. A public figure can mistake being watched for being followed. Bryant's challenge is to know the difference. The people who watch a storm are not always standing inside the shelter. The people who repeat a sermon clip are not always committed to the vision. And the people who defend him online may not be enough to persuade those who quietly wonder whether the ministry has become too dependent on conflict. There is also the question of spiritual fatigue. Congregations can become tired of defending their leaders, even when they still love them. They can become weary of explaining headlines to friends, family, co-workers, and strangers online. They can become frustrated when the public conversation about their church is not about service, prayer, outreach, or transformation, but about the personality at the top. This kind of fatigue does not always announce itself dramatically. People do not always leave loudly. Sometimes they simply become quieter. They stop defending. They stop inviting others. They still attend, but with less emotional certainty. They still listen, but with more internal distance. For a pastor, that kind of slow withdrawal can be more dangerous than open rebellion, because it is harder to measure until the trust has already thinned. Bryant's defenders may argue that this is the price of bold leadership. They may say that any pastor who challenges systems will create tension, and that people who want a controversy-free ministry are asking for a powerless church. There is strength in that argument. Faith that never disturbs anything can become little more than decoration. The Black church, especially, has often understood that spiritual leadership must sometimes step into public fire. Bryant's public campaigns and sharp language are rooted in that expectation. But the price of boldness is not the same as the cost of avoidable distraction. A leader has to know which burdens belong to the mission and which burdens are created by his own approach. That distinction may define Bryant's next chapter. If the pressure around him is mostly because he is challenging powerful interests, he can frame it as sacrifice. But if the pressure is also being intensified by his own style, his own history, and his own appetite for confrontation, then sacrifice alone cannot explain it. The hardest part for Bryant may be that the tools that made him effective are the same tools that now place him at risk. His sharp tongue made him memorable. His willingness to confront made him visible. His sense of drama made him compelling. His refusal to stay in one lane made him nationally relevant. But those same qualities can make him look reckless when trust is low. A fiery sermon can sound prophetic when people believe the speaker, and self-serving when they do not. A public campaign can look courageous when the motives are trusted, and opportunistic when they are not. A bold statement can feel like leadership in one season, and like provocation in another. This means Bryant's future may depend not on changing his message completely, but on changing the way people interpret the man delivering it. That kind of change is difficult because it cannot be demanded. Trust cannot be commanded from the pulpit. It cannot be shouted into existence. It cannot be restored by humiliating critics or rallying loyalists. Trust is rebuilt through patterns, and patterns take time. Bryant would have to show, consistently, that the mission is bigger than his image. He would have to let the work become visible, without always placing himself at the emotional center of it. He would have to create a public rhythm, where service, accountability, humility, and strategic discipline are seen as clearly as confrontation. That may sound simple, but for a leader whose public power has often depended on intensity, restraint can feel like weakness. Yet restraint may be exactly what the moment requires. The broader lesson is that celebrity ministry is entering a harsher era. The public is less patient with leaders who seem larger than their institutions. People are more sensitive to hypocrisy, more suspicious of branding, and more willing to challenge authority that once went unquestioned. Bryant is not the only pastor facing this shift, but he is one of the clearest examples of it. His story shows what happens when spiritual leadership becomes entangled with media visibility. The platform grows, but so does the exposure. The voice travels farther, but so do the doubts. The leader becomes more influential, but also more vulnerable to being reduced to controversy. This is the bargain of modern public ministry, and it is not clear that anyone can fully control it once the bargain has been made. So as Pastor Jamal Bryant continues forward, the real question is not whether he can survive criticism. He has already survived plenty. The question is whether survival is enough. Can he lead beyond the spectacle? Can he convince skeptical observers that his activism is more than performance? Can he show his congregation and the public that the church is not being pulled into every storm created around his name? Can he transform public attention into durable confidence? These are not questions that can be answered in one sermon or one interview. They will be answered over time, through discipline, through choices, through the ability to carry influence without constantly feeding controversy. Because at this point, the danger is not that Jamal Bryant has lost his voice. The danger is that his voice may be heard through so much noise that the message itself begins to struggle for air. In the end, Pastor Jamal Bryant's story is not just about whether people like him or dislike him. It is about what happens when a religious leader becomes too visible to be judged only as a pastor, but too spiritual to be judged only as a public personality. He stands in a complicated space where every action carries multiple meanings. A sermon is not only a sermon, it becomes a statement. A public campaign is not only a campaign, it becomes a test of motive. A controversy is not only a controversy, it becomes evidence in a larger argument about character. That is the reality Bryant now faces. He may still have the crowd, the voice, the platform, and the institutional authority. But the question hovering over him is deeper than popularity. It is whether the people watching him still believe that the mission is stronger than the man's attraction to the spotlight. For some, the answer will remain yes. Bryant's supporters are not blind to the criticism, but many of them interpret his story through the lens of struggle, redemption, and resistance. They see a preacher who has made mistakes, faced judgment, and kept standing. They see a man who refuses to separate faith from the pain of the communities around him. They see a leader who understands that silence can be a luxury when people are living with inequality, economic pressure, racial tension, and institutional neglect. To them, Bryant's sharpness is necessary because the world he is confronting is not gentle. His controversy, in their eyes, is not proof of corruption, but proof that he is active in battles that matter. They do not want a pastor who sounds safe. They want one who sounds awake. For others, the answer has become more uncertain. They are not necessarily hostile to his causes. They may even agree that churches should speak to public issues. But they worry about the pattern. They worry that Bryant's name too often becomes the headline instead of the work. They worry that the church's public image is being shaped by confrontation more than quiet transformation. They worry that the prophetic tradition he claims to represent can be weakened when it is mixed too heavily with celebrity instincts and media drama. Their concern is not that a pastor should never be controversial. Their concern is that controversy can become a habit, and once it becomes a habit, it can quietly replace wisdom with momentum. That is the fine line Bryant must now walk. If he pulls back too much, supporters may say he has lost his fire. If he keeps pushing in the same way, critics may say he has learned nothing. If he speaks boldly, the public may examine his motives. If he remains silent, the silence may be interpreted as weakness or strategy. This is the trap of a reputation built on intensity. The public expects the same intensity that made the figure famous, but the very intensity that attracts attention can also deepen suspicion. Bryant may be entering a season where the old formula no longer works as cleanly as it once did. The fire still draws people in, but it also makes them look for smoke. And perhaps that is the most important point. The problem is not that Jamal Bryant lacks gifts. He has more than enough gifts. He can preach, organize, provoke, inspire, and dominate a room. The problem is that gifts are not the same as trust. Talent can open doors that character must keep open. Charisma can gather people that discipline must hold. Visibility can make a leader famous, but only credibility can make that leader durable. Bryant's future may depend on whether he understands that distinction before the atmosphere around him hardens into a permanent judgment. Because once the public decides that a leader's pattern is fixed, even genuine growth can be difficult to see. There is still a path forward for him, but it is not the easiest path. It would require less performance and more steadiness, less immediate reaction and more strategic restraint, less dependence on public battles and more visible investment in long-term trust. It would require showing people that the church he leads is more than the personality leading it. It would require allowing the mission to become clearer than the controversy. And perhaps most difficult of all, it would require Bryant to accept that not every attack deserves a stage. Not every critic deserves a sermon, and not every moment of public attention is a blessing. Some attention can elevate a ministry. Some attention can slowly consume it. This is why things are not looking simple for Pastor Jamal Bryant. Not because he is finished, and not because one headline can erase decades of influence. Public life is rarely that clean. But things do look uncertain, because the same forces that helped build his platform are now testing its foundation. The charisma that made him compelling has also made him polarizing. The activism that made him relevant has also exposed him to sharper scrutiny. The visibility that amplified his voice has also preserved every question surrounding him. And the past, instead of staying behind him, continues to reappear whenever the present becomes controversial. So the final question is not whether Jamal Bryant can preach through another storm. He almost certainly can. He has done it before. The question is whether he can lead beyond the storm. Can he build a public identity that does not depend on crisis? Can he restore confidence among those who are not already convinced? Can he prove that the fire in his voice is connected to a foundation strong enough to hold the people who trust him? Or will the noise around his name continue to grow until it becomes impossible to separate the pastor from the controversy? That is the unresolved tension at the heart of his story. Pastor Jamal Bryant may still have the microphone, but the real test now is whether the message can rise above the doubt surrounding the man who delivers it.